1999 The Podcast is a production of the Cage Club Podcast Network. For more podcasts on movies, comics, and all things pop culture, head to cageclub.me. To contact us with questions, comments, or just to say hi, send us an email at 1999@cageclub.me. You can find me on Twitter at probablyrealjb and Joey at soulpopped. And you can follow the show on Twitter at 1999 The Podcast. To support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. The show is written, produced, and edited by us. Last year, 375 trans people were murdered, a record number in the time that such data has been recorded. Trans people as a community face an elevated risk of murder, physical violence, and suicide, and recent trends suggest that risk is growing. And an emboldened right-wing political movement in America continues to push legislation that puts trans people, and especially trans youth, at risk, if not in direct harm. If you'd like to help, consider donating or otherwise supporting the National Center for Transgender Equality, the Transgender Law Center, Trans Justice Funding Project, or the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Or help support groups like the Trevor Project or the Trans Lifeline. Or you can refer to the website Transgender Map, linked to in the show notes, and research other groups at transgendermap.com/resources/advocacy. You can also learn how to support transgender artists and creators at transgendermediaportal.org. For organizations working for trans rights in especially vulnerable states like Florida, Texas, and Ohio, you can support groups like Trans Action Florida, Trans Pride Initiative in Texas, and Trans Ohio. Trans rights are human rights. Links to all these organizations' websites are available in the show notes. Welcome to 1999 The Podcast. I am John Brooks.
And I'm Joey Lewandowski.
Joey, how are you today?
I am well. How are you?
I am well. Yeah, it's hot. And that's about it. It's hot outside. So yeah. I'm inside with the air conditioning. And about to get solar panels too, which I'm really excited about.
Mine just got turned on this week. They got installed a couple of months ago, and they are now on and collecting the sun.
It's like free. People should know that it's free.
Well, it's not. I mean, I think it wildly varies from state to state, but basically it's not costing me more, and they're actually paying me. It's just that if I sell this house, then I have to pay for the rest of the system. I mean, you can also rent it. There's a whole thing. Consult your, but there's also a lot of like scammers out there. Like get someone like a legitimate solar provider. But yes, if you think, hey, this is going to cost me money, it's not.
I did like 8 minutes of research and found a really good company, and we are going to be paying less than we do now for electricity. And like what we're paying for is just like the solar panels. So that's cool. So I'll feel less bad about using so much air conditioning in the summertime, offsetting my carbon footprint a little bit. So yeah, that's the most exciting thing that has happened to me lately. Anyway, we should get to today's movie, which unfortunately is not a delightful 1980s rock opera set to the timeless music of The Cure and telling the story of the young Robert Smith, as the title would imply, but rather a deeply problematic depiction of the events leading up to the 1993 rape and murder of 21-year-old trans man Brandon Teena, or at least that is what the movie claims to be. Released October 22nd, 1 week after our last film, Fight Club. While the number one song of the time was in the U.S. was Carlos Santana's "Smooth" featuring Rob Thomas.
Ooh, yeah.
One of the most memed songs of all time.
I loved that song when I was 12 years old and this was out. 11 years old? 11 years old.
Almost I didn't even like it then. I like Rob Thomas. I think he's cool. I think he's a good dude.
Yeah, but you were like a full-grown person at that time. I was 11.
I was. I found it annoying. I like Carlos Santana, and I like Rob Thomas. I don't necessarily love Rob Thomas's music, but I think he's like an interesting and nice guy.
Well, he also created Veronica Mars, which is cool.
Yeah.
Same guy.
Same guy. Don't look it up.
Just watch Veronica Mars and created by Rob Thomas. Oh, cool. I guess that's the guy from Matchbox 20. Very cool. Okay, cool.
There can't have been two Rob Thomases in the late 1990s / early 2000s. That would be illegal.
Unique name.
Right. You gotta have at least a middle initial in there, like
well, like on Futurama, David X. Cohen. Right. I listen to every commentary. He's just like, oh yeah, he's like a normal middle name. He's like, but there was another David Cohen in the Academy or whatever. And he's like, I need to register, so I'm just David X. Cohen. So like, you're never not sure that it's me. It's like, I'm always that one because it's the one with the X.
Or like Vanessa L. Williams and Vanessa Williams.
Sure.
fans of the first season of Melrose Place will know what I'm talking about. Or did you know that like Michael? This is off track. Do you know that Michael Keaton's real last name is Douglas? But like
I
he
think
couldn't
I
use that.
did.
Yeah, so he couldn't use it. So now he's Michael Keaton.
Carlos Estevez, now
Anyway,
Charlie Sheen, now out of work.
what we're really talking about today is a movie starring Hilary Swank, Chloe Sevigny, and Peter Sarsgaard, written by Kimberley Peirce and Andy. I think it's Bainan. It might be Beenan. Pretty sure it's Bainan. Directed by Kimberley Peirce, Boys Don't Cry was one of the most praised and decorated movies of the year. It was nominated for 57 major awards
Ooh.
and won 37 of them, 14 of which went to star Hilary Swank, 6 to co-star Chloe Sevigny, and 8 to writer-director Kimberley Peirce. Swank, of course, won the Oscar for Best Actress for this role, and Sevigny was nominated for Best Supporting. With a 90% Rotten Tomatoes critic score and a pretty astonishing 86% Metacritic score, one might get the impression that Boys Don't Cry was and is a universally admired classic.
What I will say is that it's my least favorite movie we've watched this season yet.
I would agree.
It's a real like dogfight at the bottom between this and American Beauty, but there's like a gap. There's a gulf. There's a Grand Canyon style gorge between number 6 and number 7 right now.
Yeah, and they're problematic for different reasons.
Yeah,
and have they've I think the revision of them is very different. Why they're problematic, and I think to some degree, like American Beauty is worse.
I think I would be more inclined to watch that movie before I rewatch this movie.
Yes, yeah,
Because I think
I
there are more
agree.
things that I like about that, and we'll talk about this in the episode, I'm sure. But there's more things, not about American Beauty, but there's things about American Beauty that we talked about in that episode are like objectively good. It's just surrounded by stuff that's not good, and with other things to be concerned about. But this is, oh boy,
And the exploitation factor, I think, is a big one too. Like American Beauty is obviously not a true story, and
it's
this
not.
is present. No, although that bag really did fly around, but other than that, I think it's mostly fictionalized.
Did I say on that episode that every time I see a bag, I think of that goddamn movie?
Yeah, that's the point. That's what it wants you to
Is
do.
it the point? I
Yeah,
guess it is probably. Okay.
point of the movie. We got a string of movies that we love coming up after this, so
Well,
that's going to
have
be
we
a nice
teased?
break.
Is season 2 blockbusters? Is that the theme for season 2?
No, season 2 is sort of the ones that the 9 movies that didn't make the top 9, but
The
are,
back
if we're
9.
expanding it to 18, it's the back 9.
Okay.
We're going to do
Oh,
blockbusters
blockbusters a
in a
future
coming.
season. Right.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we do have that coming up, or would be blockbusters that weren't. Is I think a more fun, and there's a lot of those in '99 as well. Anyway, Roger Ebert called Boys Don't Cry one of the best films of the year. If you read reviews of it, you get words like stunning, poignant, profound, sort of generously tossed about in critical reviews. Most praise the filmmaking itself and the acting, both of which, from a like completely removed and technical standpoint, I think are the movie's strong points. And the San Francisco Chronicle's Peter Stack writing that, quote, there may not be a better acted film this year. Entertainment Weekly's Owen Gleiberman called Swank a, quote, revelation. And among major critics, only Time Magazine's Elizabeth L. Bland has anything bad of note to say about the movie, criticizing it for favoring style over substance. But among the most telling reviews is that of Rolling Stone's Peter Travers, who, full disclosure, is a terrific film critic who I love, and I love Peter Travers' writing.
I'm surprised by that. I thought he was known as being like the guy who will say a thing to get on the movie poster and just sort of
Oh
like
no, Peter Travers.
he's
Oh,
a
he's a
legit
very,
one.
very
Okay.
good writer. Yeah, I mean, unless there's people who like fundamentally disagree with that, that's fine. But I've always thought Peter Travers is an excellent film critic. I think you're thinking like is it David Lyons. I think that's the one you're thinking of. Who like literally his
No
job
idea.
is
Maybe.
just to like say good things about movies for blurbs. And whatever. But Peter Travers, no, wrote for Rolling Stone for a really long time. Was a very, very good critic. But he gave Boys Don't Cry a rave review. And his opening paragraph, I think, is really telling to some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Here's what he says. Quote, it's a true story that screams tabloid sensationalism. 6 years ago in Nebraska, 20-year-old Brandon Teena was raped and later murdered by 2 ex-cons who became enraged that the boy they hung out with for months was really Teena Brandon, a girl who strapped her breasts and stuffed a stock in her jeans. Amazingly, what could have been fodder for Jerry Springer becomes, in the hands of director and co-writer Kimberley Peirce, a shockingly intimate and deeply affecting film about the roots of sexual role-playing. And there's so much in that paragraph that is so goddamn cringeworthy. I just like, this to me encapsulates like everything that was wrong about what people who were praising this movie were saying.
Sure.
And it stunned me to see him be this tone deaf. To be fair, it's as tone deaf as his review gets. But it points to a common criticism that's been leveled at the film since, that it's too sensationalist and it's not really about a trans man, at least in the way that Peirce frames the film. In fact, the film had effectively zero input or participation from anyone in the trans community whatsoever. So, you know, and this is something that, if you go back to our first episode, this is something that Brian Raftery alluded to, that this is one of those movies that is one of the real kind of major sources of revision in the last 23 years. The reception then is not the reception now, and that a lot of people have a lot of things to say about this movie that is not so great. In 2019, at the 20-year anniversary of Boys Don't Cry, Trish Bendix wrote a piece for the New York Times titled "Boys Don't Cry 20 Years Later, For Trans Men, A Divisive Legacy. Was the movie a landmark in representation or distressingly exploitative? It was both and so much more." Here's some excerpts from that piece. Quote, "The film's success catapulted Teena's story into the mainstream. For many Americans, it was their first introduction to a trans man, though there's never any version of trans in the dialogue. And the fact that that movie was told largely from Teena's point of view, presenting him as someone audiences could empathize with, was celebrated in some LGBT circles. At the time, the cultural conversation around transgender lives was virtually non-existent. They were asked to take a backseat to other LGBT activists so progress could be made on issues deemed more palatable to the mainstream, like ending the military's don't ask, don't tell policy. Trans people, largely trans women, were depicted in the movies and tabloids as deceitful cross-dressers more often than not. Transgender men were absent from any media, and several reviews of the film incorrectly described Teena as a young woman posing as a man, not living his true identity." And then Bendix goes on to say, "Perhaps the most well-known piece of popular culture about a transgender man, Boys Don't Cry, bears the burden of representation for a highly underrepresented group of people, and has become polarizing for some trans viewers. After a screening in 2016, protesters at Reed College in Portland, Oregon disrupted a Q&A with Peirce, arguing that the film was transphobic and exploitative for its casting of a cisgender actress and depiction of a brutal rape. Were the film being made today, activists would insist on a trans actor in a trans role. Scarlett Johansson withdrew from the film Rub and Tug last year after such an outcry. At the time, there wasn't any organized objection to Swank's casting. Peirce said she'd auditioned several, quote, masculine of center people, in parentheses, butch women, drag queens, and some trans men, before finding Swank in search for a performer who could, quote, walk into an everyday environment and be perceived as a man. But for trans men like the actor J.J. Hawkins, the optics of Swank appearing highly feminine on red carpets were confusing and had real-world consequences. Of course, it's a step in the right direction, one single story about us, but also she played a boy and she won Best Actress," Hawkins said. "That was the first time I realized that people who see me as a girl dressed up as a boy because they're watching Boys Don't Cry, they're watching a girl dressed up as a boy. Similar issues have arisen with recent trans women's portrayals by Jared Leto in Dallas Buyers Club and Jeffrey Tambor in Transparent." So, I think that sums up a lot of what is wrong about this movie. And I guess if you are kind of new to this conversation, if you've never seen Boys Don't Cry, if you don't know what all this is about, the criticisms here is that it perpetuates notions of what it is to be trans that are very set in sort of a narrow view from the 1990s, and that honestly is the way that it's portrayed in the movie, and that was not necessary, right? That was something the movie did sort of by choice.
Yeah. I don't know how to say that. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
All right, lastly, in another 2019 essay titled "Boys Don't Cry Has Always Been Violently Transphobic," writer Logan Ashley Kisner says, quote, "Peirce and Swank talked a lot about Swank's audition. and she made the effort to be as masculine as possible, packing and binding, attempting to speak in a lower register, and etc. And this got her noticed. But the part of the story that sticks out to me is where Swank lied about her age. The citation of this part of the story seems to have been lost to the pits of old internet, but in short, during her audition, Swank, who was 22, lied to Peirce about her age. Swank said that, like Brandon, she was 21 years of age. When Peirce later confronted her about her lie, Swank responded, "But that's what Brandon would do." Hilary Swank was cast in part because she portrayed Brandon as a liar. To her and everybody involved, Brandon Teena was a woman who lied, who deceived, who spun the truth, even in completely unnecessary situations. The portrayal of trans people as liars is such a deeply dangerous thing. It's the thing, in fact, that gets us murdered. And yes, I know that this movie came out in 1999, and it's not exactly the greatest time for trans people or any LGBT person. Almost every article from the late 90s misgenders Brandon, refers to him as a woman or a lesbian, or only ever referred to him in the context of sex in the context of lying. You know, the only two things trans people are ever brought up for: how we fuck or who we're fooling. In conclusion, Kisner says Boys Don't Cry is important in that it is one of only a few mainstream depictions of transgender men, but outside of that distinction, there is nothing special or valuable to warrant remembering. When there is finally an outpouring of transgender content in the same way that there is for general LGB content, although, of course, this is still meek in comparison to the cishet media market, I think that Boys Don't Cry will finally be allowed to be pushed back into relative obscurity, a film that, while notable for the time of its release, no longer should be used as an educational tool. So this is a movie with a lasting legacy and a very complicated one. And so, Joey, who is our guest to talk to us today about Boys Don't Cry?
Our guest is who you're just quoting and reading from. Our guest today is writer and transgender horror historian Logan Ashley Kisner.
Oh, what a coincidence.
When you started reading his work that he was going to be on this very episode? I don't think you did.
I could never have guessed. Serendipity. All right, stick around. We'll be right back with Logan. Logan Ashley, welcome to 1999 the podcast. It's great to have you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about yourself before we get into the movie. I reached out to you because you 3 years ago wrote a essay about the movie in question that I found very compelling, and wanted to have your voice on the show. But you also write a lot about trans horror as a sort of a subgenre. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that first. Have you always been has horror as a genre always been a big thing for you?
Yeah, so my mom basically has seen every horror movie ever made, and so horror was just just constantly on in our house. I saw most horror movies before I saw other movies, because I was not allowed to see swearing films until I was 12, but Alien was fine. I saw the TV cut of Child's Play before I saw Die Hard.
You fit in unknowingly. You fit in. So we have found a string of guests who have grown up in the most irresponsible households with parents who seemingly loving parents who are just yeah, watch the most grisly shit you can imagine. It's just all right, cool, go for it, I guess.
Yeah, and so just the whole life grew up in horror, and then eventually as I came into my own identity, I'm okay, how can I make these two interests mesh? And then I ended up finding this trans horror stuff that people had written about before obviously I wrote anything, but it was very disjointed and never the whole picture. And I'm oh, here's this very interesting aspect of horror history that has just kind of gone unreported, basically.
That's interesting, because horror as a genre, it does a lot of different things. It is a good vessel through which to kind of, I think, tell a lot of different stories and to convey ideas that maybe are difficult to encapsulate, right? How, in general, do you think that the function of trans horror as a genre in terms of communicating the trans experience, right, for lack of a better term, how useful do you think it is, and what are some really good examples that you have come across?
Ooh. See, horror is like a very literal genre in my experience, just because it can
Mhm.
like, it literalizes like our fears. Like, you're afraid of this thing, and now it's a literal monster in front of you that you have to like
Right.
punch in the face. And I'm working on like a really, really big writing piece right now, like trying to like tie the actual like social and political history into like the films that we're seeing. And there's a lot of like, not crossover, but definitely influence. Like, um, it's funny. I rewatched Sleepaway Camp yesterday, and just the visceralness of that movie still is so striking.
I was looking at your letterbox last night because that is one of my favorite movies, and I know that it is problematic in like 10
Yes.
different ways, but I adore the ballsiness of it so much. And I was like, please don't let me see like 1 star. And I think you wound up giving like 3 stars. It's like, okay, at least you understand like why you can love. I mean, there's also obvious reasons why like it's terrible and like overt and less other ways, but I'm glad that you at least appreciate the wackiness of Sleepaway Camp.
Yeah, I think it started out as a 3-star rating. I think I've bumped it up to 5 by now. I'm just like,
Perfect. That's the correct rating. That's the only one that I
fucking
will
good.
accept.
Yes.
I also like, I wonder, I mean, so Joey is correct. I also noticed this trend that we have a string of guests whose parents let them watch really inappropriate, or didn't let them watch sometimes, but like they got away with watching very inappropriate movies at a young age. And maybe it's turning out that that's a really good idea, and it produces really quality people. Maybe I should start letting my kids watch.
Well, you're not getting like the broken people on here. Like there are probably people who have
No,
been
that's
allowed
true.
to see those kind of things that like have turned out terribly. You're just finding people who have channeled that into creative pet endeavors. Like you're
I
not
guess
finding like
so,
people
but
who are like, nobody wants to talk to.
Imagine what I'd be doing if I wasn't writing.
right. I don't think I'm that lucky, Joey. I don't know. I think the sample size is starting to be big enough. But like, did your mom ever say to you? I mean, I watched. I'm trying to think. I watched Alien for the first time. I must have been like 13.
Ooh, I think that was
Um,
around my age too.
yeah, so still pretty young. I think Alien 3 came out when I was 12 or 13, and I saw that in the theater. And I've never really been a huge horror fan, but like, yeah, there was an age I think where my parents started kind of letting me make my own call about what I watched, or also like whatever my brother was watching. He was a few years older than I was. Like that was okay. But your mom's relationship to horror, like was she just like a horror junkie, and then just sort of was like, this is fine, and I'm okay with you watching this, but never swear in my house, or like how how did that work?
Pretty much. I think she was always just like in search of what could actually scare her, which is the vein of
That's
horror
cool.
that I have started to go down, just because I've seen so much now. I'm like, okay, like nothing really like gets under my skin anymore. Let's like seek out something that's actually going to frighten me. And I think that's where she was and still is for a long time. But she loves the genre, and she has like a lot of fond memories of it, and loves like, oh, I loved, like, this was the first movie that scared me. Check out this.
Do you two have a favorite horror movie together? Like not like necessarily your favorite or her favorite, but one that you love together that a comfort horror film, if you will.
She doesn't rewatch movies a lot, but I will say that
Am I her mom?
my dad introduced me to Evil Dead, and that's our thing, like
That's awesome.
100%.
Wait, what do you, not to derail us further, John, but what do you think of the Fede Alvarez Evil Dead?
I like it. It's definitely not the
Okay.
original trilogy, but it's one of the better remakes that I've seen, in that it remakes the original story without like retelling it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I'm not crazy about, like, I don't have a super close connection to the first one, but I was just like, this is like just like kind of just over the top gross to be kind of gross. I mean, like the raining blood scene, like I will never like it just
Yes.
there's some visuals from that are really, really cool. It just his shtick doesn't quite work for me, but okay. Back to the show.
No, I love this. This is great. It's good to talk about movies that we actually don't hate, because we're gonna get there,
We're easing
in
in.
a moment. Yeah, we're easing in. Logan, you're also the first guest that we've had, and this is pretty interesting, who was not born at the time of this podcast subject, which kind of, I mean, as a person who was 19 and 20 years old in the year in question, a little bit blows my mind, that we have, functioning adults who were not born in 1999. You were born in the year 2000. Is that correct?
Yep, April 2000.
But I actually, like, I'm glad, because one of the reasons that I reached out to you, I found that element of this really interesting as well. That I think you have a removal from a lot of the sort of zeitgeist of this movie that a lot of people don't have, and can see it in an objective way, that some other people who I think even like feel the same way about this movie that you do, don't necessarily have. So yeah, this is our first. We have a first post 1999 guest. Interesting, very cool. And let's get into the first times that we saw this movie. Now, when you wrote your essay, was that your first exposure to it, or had you seen it before?
That was my second time watching it. The first time, because the year prior, I had wanted to do watch a series of films about trans men, and it was literally one film every day. And by the point that I got to Boys Don't Cry, I think I would have hated anything that I was watching. It was just so many bad movies in a row. And so when I went to write this essay, I'm like, okay, you need to watch this again, get a fresh, unaltered perspective. Still hated it, but definitely I watched it through a different lens. And same when I rewatched it for this podcast. I'm like, it needs to be fresh in your mind. You need to come at this with as fresh a mind as you can, so it's not tainted by retrospect.
So your first experience, you saw it as sort of a part of a project, didn't like it then, didn't like it the second time, and have it seems increasingly hated it since then. In that first experiment where you're sort of watching this series of movies about trans men, is there anything that stuck out that is the opposite of Boys Don't Cry, or something that was actually good and worth seeing?
Oh God, I'm trying to think. Just in the sense that it revealed to me how few films there are. Yeah. I think also, especially in comparison to how many films there are about trans women, there just aren't a lot of films about trans men out there. There's a lot of cross-dressing women, and especially in the horrors, especially in horror films, there are a lot of films where transness is the symptom of abuse and mental illness, and it's not its own identity, basically. Mm-hmm. That being said, I did find a lot of good documentaries. Southern Comfort is a documentary about Robert Eads, who was a trans man who died of ovarian cancer because doctors would not treat him because he was trans.
Oh, Jesus.
And okay. It's a stone cold bummer of an ending that you know is coming. But the documentary itself is actually about society has left me to die. Let me find my home and community with my own people. And in that aspect of the documentary, it's actually a very even when we have nothing, we have each other. Yeah. That kind of small hope.
Joey, what about you? When was the first time you saw Boys Don't Cry?
Last night. It's, I was saying to you, the movies that I haven't seen from 1999, I probably haven't seen for a reason. And I know that when we were planning this season, we were deciding on the 9 biggest movies, and I think we landed on this one for this first season solely because Hilary Swank won Best Actress for this.
Yeah, partly, yeah.
And I think in terms of because American Beauty, whole other ball of wax, won basically everything else, and so I think that this sort of shapes sort of the narrative of that. But I think it was a movie that I don't remember people talking about. I think I was too young. I was not reading about movies at this time. It's a movie that clearly has not really aged well. That I don't know that there's necessarily, and I don't necessarily feel like I'm the right person to speak about this, but I don't know that there's a reason to see this today unless you're going through and trying to, classify and categorize and bring to light all the different types of this story. But there's just better examples of just about everything this movie tries to do. And yeah,
that's fair. My first experience watching it was very different.
Did you see this in theaters?
Yeah. And I want to make clear, the reason that this is on our first list of first 9, again, the 9 does not endorse the movie. It is not us. We've said it before on the podcast, but it's not us saying these are our favorite movies or the best or whatever. These are the movies that I think cast the largest shadow. And I know when we first talked about what the first 9 would be, this came up, and I was like, I really think this needs to be on there. Again, not because it's good or but because of I think sort of how much it's stretched in the memory of people, maybe for not great reasons. And of course also, that Hilary Swank won the Academy Award for this, and that put it very much sort of on the cultural radar. I remember when this came out, like it was a big sort of like it had made sort of the art house run and had a lot of word of mouth of being very, very powerful and everything else, and being a like very important movie TM, sort of a vibe. And I saw it, and I was very, at the time, moved by it. I did find it very powerful, but I also want people to understand that this was like almost 12 months after Matthew Shepard, which was a moment that changed a lot about the national conversation about LGBTQIA, like existence and rights and all and that sort of thing. And I think it in a weird way, like it got sort of wrapped up into that. And one of the things that like I hadn't really thought about it specifically much since until I read Logan's essay. I knew that something rubbed me the wrong way about it. Like a lot of things did, sort of in retrospect. But I also want to point out that like I, having been born in 1979, lived through, I think, the most radical shift in attitudes and the way that people like talk about just like queer identity in general. I know there's been a lot of like blowback to that in recent years because of fucking conservatives, but still, like, if so much has changed since when I was like in middle school and like Don't Ask, Don't Tell was passed, right, and that sort of thing. So yeah, like I've had a very like complicated history with this movie. I do, yeah, I think it's very problematic, and I think it's important to talk about the reasons why it's problematic, and that sort of, I think, brings us to Logan. So Logan, I'm going to say this. Here is what Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus blurb says about Boys Don't Cry, and I want to get your response. Here's what it says.
Oh,
keeping in mind it is a 90% critic score, certified fresh, and an 87% audience score of 50,000 plus ratings. The critical consensus about Boys Don't Cry says, harrowing yet stirring, Boys Don't Cry powerfully commemorates the life and brutally unjust death of transgender teen Brandon Teena. Logan, is that an accurate description of Boys Don't Cry?
I think it's certainly an accurate description through the eyes of people who don't know.
Great.
Because, okay, so whenever I bring up like my own trans identity, Boys Don't Cry is always brought up in pretty rapid succession to like people who are just meeting me, because they're like, oh, this is my first exposure to trans men. Ergo, I must connect the dots. And so in the sense that this was probably the first time that most of society like knew that trans men existed, that summary tracks, because trans women have the most visibility and have since the 50s, and trans men have always been behind in that visibility, I guess. Whether that's good or bad is like a debate we can have, but just trans women have always been more visible, and trans men have always kind of just been, I guess, the underbelly of transness. Like, people don't really think about us. And so when this movie came out, everybody was like, oh wow, this is like a thing I should know about. Like, by virtue of being the first and only one, it must be the good one.
Right. Yeah, and I think also that's a little bit how I felt. And I want to make clear, like, I was not naive, and I was not kind of like sheltered. Like, I went to an arts high school, right, where I, like, being a straight male at that school was like very much the minority, right?
Like, say no more.
Right, which was cool, and like I'm very grateful. Like, I'm glad like that I had that experience, and it gave me like an opportunity that a lot of people, my age at that time, like, did not have, and that was awesome. But I certainly was not exposed in that setting to like trans identity, right, in any meaningful way, because like it was still one of those things that the vocabulary for it and like the social acceptance of it was just not present, and not not permeated. And this movie was, even my misgivings about it at the time was at least a moment where I was like, oh yeah, I get that trans people in America are subjected to a lot of horrific and sometimes fatal violence, and like have a much higher risk of murder and death. and you know, I was also sort of heartened by the fact that a lot of people saw it. I guess like now thinking back, the things that you raise that I think are really important to talk about is that it avoids actually engaging with trans identity in any meaningful way, right? That it like a lot of like I like that you pointed to some of these like reviews, that a lot of the summaries and reviews are like, you know, Brandon Teena was a girl living as a man, and it's like, well, no, that's not really what's happening, and this is not the way to talk
Well, I
about
think
it.
the reviews, I mean, in the this is a wild sentence I'm about to say, but like in the reviews' defense, I think they're confused because the movie's kind of confused in a
Right,
certain way,
right, right,
right?
right, right,
Yeah.
right,
So I think it's
right.
hard to like, if you think about like if this is one of the first mainstream depictions of this type of story, it would the logic would follow that the people who are watching this and reviewing this do not have experience in watching or reviewing this kind of thing, and so they're taking the cues from the movie. They're like, you know, this is, you know, I'm sure she did a research, I'm sure this is good, like I'm going to take this movie as gospel. And so yeah, I don't want to defend the reviewers, but I think that, you know, there's a weird untrue sort of logic to why the reviews are as kind of misguided as they are.
Yeah. And I have learned this extensively. Audiences are babies in terms of trans knowledge. You, as a, like, if you're a filmmaker going to tackle trans identities, go as basic as you can and work your way up, because
Mm.
you like Psycho is my favorite example of this. Like, the movie stops in its tracks, turns to the camera and says, Norman is not trans in any way, shape, or form. And 50 years later, look where we are.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I like also I like the vocabulary at the time was that transsexual, transvestite, drag queen, these were all the same thing in the minds
Yeah.
of like most people. And I think that, and let me know, like I want to get your take on this. I think that the biggest sin that Boys Don't Cry, if we're going to be very generous about it, right, the biggest sin that it commits in the most sort of generous sense is that it had an opportunity to um, illuminate that distinction and utterly fails to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when Kimberley Peirce has like said that she looked at trans people in casting and ultimately decided to go with Hilary Swank. Like, you looked the correct path in the eye and turned away from it.
Yeah, talk more about that though, because like there's this one of the things that you highlight is there's this, and I kind of alluded to this a second ago, but there's this sort of there's also this sort of mainstream idea that like every queer person is an ally of every other queer person, and so like Kimberly Peirce gets a pass on everything because she is part of the queer community. Like,
Yeah, so I don't want to be outright cruel, but I will say that I am frustrated, I feel like, is the nicest way to put it, because as somebody who was not alive in the year 1999, I admit that I'm not fully cognizant of what the queer community was like back
yeah,
then. But as I was watching like this movie yesterday, it took me like 3 hours to get through it, because I kept pausing it and like going to do more readings just to like affirm to myself how much bullshit this was. And what I found this time around, just going through the digital transgender archive, is how many trans people were like showing up in protests and in visuals. They were protesting Saturday Night Live, like in response to jokes they were making about Brandon Teena. And it was the realization that, oh no, like trans people weren't just like scattered vaguely to the wind, and Kimberly Peirce like tried her hardest and couldn't find anybody to consult with. Like, trans people were always there, but it was more convenient for her to ignore it, because she saw this story as an opportunity to make this great lesbian love story, to the point of grossly cutting down what the reality of the story was.
yeah. I'm trying to like also like put myself back in the 23 years ago frame of mind, and like and try to remember what sort of the characterization of Brandon Teena was to people who talked about the movie. And as you like in your writing, as you talked about it as Kimberly Peirce writing this as basically a lesbian Romeo and Juliet, I'm like, yeah, I think that's actually kind of what I took from it, um, which is super fucked up. And also, as you sort of point out over and over again, right? Like not the case. I also like, I just want to very quickly say that like I hate the fact that the right has ruined the goddamn name Brandon for me. Like I can't even like they ruined fucking everything, but like even that name they won't leave alone. So I'm just gonna say that real quick. But let's talk about this. Like who was Brandon Teena, and like what is this movie miss about Brandon's life?
I think that's a really interesting question, just in the sense that we know so little about Brandon outside of who he dated. Just because that's what so much of the media coverage focused on at the time was the women he like. The Donna Minkowitz "Love Hurts" article was like the first really big news article about Brandon, and it was almost entirely composed of interviews with ex-girlfriends. And it was all like, oh, I had no idea he was trans. Like, he was such a great lover. Like, I had no idea. And it focused very little on who he was as a person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we know that he wanted to join the military and he was like incredibly upset that he couldn't. And we know that he had like definitely, I would say, an issue with the law. But outside of that, like, we factually know very little about his life outside of his relationship to and with other people, which I think is like really frustrating as well.
So like if you were gonna make a good movie about Brandon, like is that movie worth making? And like do you think, I don't know, like if some actual, you know, trans writer director came along and wanted to do it, like is it worth doing? And do you think like in doing that in some way you might be able to clean up some of the mess that Boys Don't Cry left behind?
I think it might be possible. And like, even if you wanted to do a love story still with Brandon, like I make note of this in my essay too. Like, he had a long-term girlfriend that he broke up with like right before the events of the film happened. And one of the last things that I think it was a Playboy interview that I read called "Death of the Deceiver," which great title, thank you Playboy. It mentions this ex-girlfriend like went to his funeral and like talked to Lana Tisdale, and she's like, "What was he like?" And Lana was like, well, he kept mentioning this one ex-girlfriend that he still really, really loved. And I'm like, there's your fucking movie.
Yeah.
If you want to make this a love story, like, not this girl that he knew arguably very little of and for a brief period of time. Like, he had, and that's another thing that I found while reading a lot yesterday. He had so many people who loved him, and people who they say like that knew about his transness and loved him either because or in spite of or any variation thereof. Like, regardless of his identity, like, they just loved who he was, and he was a friendly person that people like to be around. And there's a movie to be made about the tragedy of a loss like that and what the post-death outing of him did to people's perception of him. I don't know. Like, I would be interested, I think, to see like maybe a short film about that. I don't know if a feature length. Like, I think, ooh, that's another issue I have with this film is that it focuses so much on the brutalization, and I feel like
Yeah.
a smarter filmmaker could have still made the impact hit without necessarily showing the brutality.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of why I brought up Matthew Shepard, because there was this like one of the I've read a lot of essays about sort of in retrospect about Matthew Shepard and how, you know, a lot of them pointing out like, well, I mean, a lot of like non-white boys had been murdered before Matthew Shepard, and yet this is the one that grabs the nation's attention. And like, yeah, okay, like baked in American racism, absolutely. Um, but in this really perverse way, I think Matthew Shepard gave mainstream America a way of being like, oh, I'm interested in these stories of, you know, queer people being brutalized, and that's my entryway to like feeling empathy for people, which is in and of itself like very fucked up and something about our psychology as a society that we should definitely look at. Um, but the other thing is that, like, that I keep sort of thinking about. I think about this a lot when it comes to representation. Like a little bit sidetrack here. I'm gonna tell you something I tell my classes sometimes, which is, you know, we talk about like race representation in the media, and I tell them that when I was growing up, like in the 1980s, there's a certain period of time in the 80s when the two most famous and most beloved people in America, right, were Bill Cosby and Michael Jackson.
Oh,
Right?
hell yeah.
Yeah. And I remember when I was in fourth grade, we had this prompt for a homework assignment that was, if you could meet one person in the world, who would it be, right? And we did the thing that you do in elementary school, where the teacher, calls and everybody's like, well, do you want to read yours? Do you want to read yours? And the first 4 were like about Michael Jackson. and the teacher was like, did anybody not write about Michael Jackson? It was like 3 kids who didn't write about Michael Jackson, right? But the reason why I bring that up is because one of the dangers of the way that we do representation, right, is that in that case, of course, both of those people's legacies are irreparably damaged, right? Like there's no way of kind of getting that back now. That genie's out of the bottle. But when you only allow 2 Black people to represent all Black people within a certain cultural context, like this is the danger that you run into, right? And so the thing about Boys Don't Cry is that while I can acknowledge that it was the first thing that really got me to start thinking about trans issues, and I learned a hell of a lot more after it, right? I never like went back to it as a resource. There is this tendency to like, once we sort of open up the window into marginalized communities, we tend to start with the suffering, right? We tend to start with the violence. We tend to start with the most kind of salacious stories. The issue here, I think, is that we haven't really gotten much further, right? Like, I don't think there hasn't been another movie of this kind of caliber and exposure since then, as far as like I can think, right? That has sort of, I don't know, recentered the discussion of trans identity. So I what do you think about all of that spiel that I just gave? I'm sorry, I sort of went off on a tangent there, but
no, you're good. No, martyrdom is still a very convenient topic for filmmakers to latch onto, because it provides a way to give representation and also, like, I guess, self-flagellation in a sense of like, oh, look how terrible we are to this population, without like materially really doing anything besides just like portraying more suffering and being like, oh, look how much it sucks that this population has to go through this. Here's more of that sucky suffering. And I'm working on that project now, and there's a quote from Jeremy Miller, who wrote about cross-dressing cinema, and she talks about how in transgender thrillers, the identity is framed as only being interesting when it's being revealed. And that hits the nail on the head for me, just in the sense of like, how many films are there where the representation is shoehorned in at the end as a twist and not as a fully fleshed character who has an identity outside of their marginalization, I guess.
Like, what are some examples of that?
Oh God. Well, it's because I watched it last night. I started writing about it more, but Sleepaway Camp.
Okay.
Wait, John, have you seen Sleepaway Camp?
I've never.
I know other movies.
I've never seen Sleepaway Camp. I'm definitely going to now.
What do you know about Sleepaway Camp?
So I know about it's this. I know that it's this like girl shows up at camp and she's very unpopular and marginalized, and so she kills everybody. And like that's pretty much all I know about it.
Okay, because
okay,
is that it?
I don't want to spoil.
No, and
it
like,
now.
Spoil it.
And Brent, we it's not possible to talk about why this movie, because it doesn't make any sense. I get, because I guess spoiling it.
You can spoil it. I might not be able to watch it. It might be too viscerally like graphic for me. So
no, it's not. It's
not in the sense of gore.
It's also like the best ever example of like Long Island kids in the 80s.
See, I love that. All right.
It has my all-time favorite. This is a spoiler and a different kind. It has my all-time favorite movie line where one kid says, "Eat shit and die, Billy," and he goes, "Eat shit and live, Rick," or something. Whatever.
Nice. Oh, great comeback.
Perfect. But yeah. Anyway,
I love that.
And Logan, I guess gotta, because
you can spoil it. Like, if it's important to the conversation, like spoil the movie. I will. I
don't know that it is, but you have to spoil the movie to talk about why it's a trans movie.
Yeah, and that's the case for a lot of trans movies, where you're like, I had no idea. Like, yes, because they kept that hidden, because that's their big shiny twist every single time.
But like, what's interesting about this one is that it's sort of a big shiny twist, but like to no end. Like, there's not a reason for it.
Yeah.
Other than to shock the audience and be like, oh my God, can you believe it?
Yeah, so I guess I'll try and keep it vague. Let's try and still my point. Basically, there's a transgender twist at the end of Sleepaway Camp, and the first thing that the sequel does is say, oh, that character had sexual reassignment surgery. They don't have the big scary penis anymore. And the subsequent sequels like never acknowledge that character's transsexuality again because it's been revealed, and it's you can't throw the cat out of the box twice, basically. Like, they can't have the same ending in every single film. So the identity is no longer interesting. They stop talking about it. And that's, there's not a lot of sequels in like the transgender film canon. There's like that and Psycho, I guess, but yeah. So, and I guess Boys Don't Cry is interesting in that the audience knows this before the characters do, and that's kind of rare in that sense.
Right. I think the other movie that, I don't know, I have to go back and watch it again, but that I remember at least, and I was much younger when I saw this, but I remember at least sort of like pushing the needle in a certain direction with The Crying Game.
Ooh, I have not seen that one, but I do know the twist and all the parts of that.
Yeah. And all right, I'll hold off on talking about it. I will let you watch The Crying Game. Maybe we'll invite you back and have like a bonus episode about The Crying Game or something. But yeah, okay. I want to switch tracks a little bit here, because I think in your piece you are, if you're generous to anybody, I think the person you're most generous to is Hilary Swank. So let's talk about Hilary Swank for a second. Joey, he messaged me earlier today and was like, I think it's interesting that Hilary Swank is basically famous for 2 movies. And I was like, yeah, The Next Karate Kid and The Core. And he's like, yeah, those are the 2.
Well, no, I mean, like, I think she's one of them. I don't know if she's one of the most famous actors, but she's one of the most famous actors that I know, who's basically, if you're like, what has she been in? It's like, well, this I knew of because she won the Oscar for, $1 Million Baby because she won maybe the Oscar for.
I think she won the Oscar for, yeah.
I wouldn't remember Next Karate Kid. I also have not seen that.
It's
and like I just saw her in Logan Lucky, and she is great in that, but she's in like 15 minutes of that. Like, she's made an entire career, rightly so. I think she's a great actor, but like, it's hard to say. I'm like, was she on a TV show for like 8 years? No, like, she's been on TV shows, but
well, she was on 90210 for a while.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
It's wild to me how famous she is, and like, I don't know that many people could name more than 3 or 4 of her movies. Is that wrong?
And is she hot? That's the no. I'm just kidding. You've seen the Office episode, right? I'm not like
no, I don't. Okay. I don't like or watch The Office. I'm sorry.
Oh, there's an episode of The Office where the entire conversation, like one of the subplots, is the whole office trying to decide if Hilary Swank is beautiful or hot, and if there's a distinction between those two things. It's very, very weird, but weirdly funny. Yeah, I know. I sure. Look, this is the movie that made Hilary Swank's career. I don't think anybody would deny that. But there's also an element of like, I remember the sort of praise at the time being a very thinly veiled, if veiled, sort of like, wow, she looks so much like a boy, and it's like, okay, like that, like, how brave of her to do this, and right, like, that's why she deserves the Oscar. Logan, like, we're going to stop doing this, right? Hopefully we're going to stop this whole like, let's cast Hilary Swank as a trans man. But I don't know. What do you have to say about Hilary Swank and like the way that Hilary Swank has talked about the experience since then?
I think out of granted, I haven't read like Chloe Sevigny, like if Chloe Sevigny has like had like any retrospect on the film or anything, but just from what I've read, Hilary Swank's probably the one who's exhibited the most growth and also sees Brandon as a human being. Because like Kimberley Peirce, I think, just saw Brandon as like a means to an end to tell the story. He was a vehicle, not a person. And Hilary Swank actually like went up on the Oscar stage and like referred to him by his given name, to the chagrin of like his mother. Even like his mother was like super pissed that she did that, but like Hilary like referred to him correctly, and like she has said like weird things that I may or may not get into, but like it's one of those things where like I can't blame her too much just because she's one part of a decades long Hollywood system of casting cis people in trans roles. But I don't blame her as much for this as I do like Kimberley Peirce for writing and directing and financing this house of cards, basically.
Yeah, that's a generous way to say it. I mean, like, you know, it's like sometimes I try to kind of be as sort of ethically removed as possible and just be like, you know, like obviously Hilary Swank is a very good actor, and in some ways, like there's elements of this movie that kind of reinforce that, and I think like I don't know, you can compartmentalize those things, right? Like there's a lot of good actors in this movie who are doing
Oh yeah.
good acting stuff, right? Like Chloe Sevigny is a fantastic actor. She's not a great tipper, but that's my I know that from working in New York City restaurants. But she's a great actor. I am a on record Peter Sarsgaard stan, and I feel very conflicted about Peter Sarsgaard because of this movie. But yeah, I mean, it's I don't know. There's I think the thing that really pisses me off about this movie more than anything else is I hate to say like how much potential it had, right? If you like look
Mhm.
at all the ingredients, but I think it is how much potential it had, and that a lot of things, some of which were sort of like where the culture was at the time, and some of which are very like Kimberley Peirce, got in the way of it, and you know, it's a sort of a lost cause at this point.
Yeah, and I believe this movie was post lawsuit. Basically, Brandon's mom and sister sued the police department for like gross negligence, and were found like, oh yeah, like this was a thing that was completely preventable, and it's because like directly of police negligence that Brandon and two other people ultimately died.
Mm.
And this, I think, if you wanted to, if you still wanted to have this film like focused on these last few weeks of Brandon's life, you could and probably should have focused more on like the negligence of the other people. And I couldn't read anywhere if Lana's mom like told John and Tom that Brandon had reported the crime, but I remember reading that like it was the sheriff who like called them. And so I found that really interesting in the film that like they switched the blame of who informed them that Brandon had reported his assault to them. And just like there's so many weird changes in motivation from like fact to film
Mm-hmm.
that I'm still trying to like figure out what the point was.
Is there any reason to see this movie?
Well, actually, in a similar sort of question, like in your cataloging of like the 31 movies that tell this kind of story, could you give alternatives to that? What this movie's trying to? I don't know what I don't. I actually don't really quite know what this movie's trying to do. But is this movie worth seeing? And also, like, are there ones that if people are like I should watch that? Like, no, actually, don't do that. Watch this instead.
I think in the sense that it's like quote unquote one of like the only movies featuring trans men, and in that like foundational sense. I think if you're curious about the genre and looking to explore like what we're coming from and what we can be going to, it's worth checking out. But if you're looking for like actual films like about transsexuality and specifically about trans men, I can there's not a lot of good fictional films. Like I can point you to a few good documentaries like Southern Comfort, and there's one from the 90s called You Don't Know Dick, which is one of the earliest documentaries about trans men.
Yeah.
Um Yentl isn't about a trans man, but I find that it's like it's like a live action Mulan, but like it's actually really good about like displaying how like presenting as a gender you're not comfortable as leads to like confusion and stress and angst, and like it's actually like I really love that
That's a
movie. I'm like
great answer.
it's not about trans men, but like it's good for the point of like here's what gender dysphoria is like and sexual confusion because of your gender.
Wow, that's a really good answer. I'd like never thought of it that way before, but I'm gonna go back and rewatch that now. It's a really interesting perspective on it. I also think like one of the I think one of the most damning things about this movie, honestly, as I thought about it, is if it were what it says it were, like if it were the sort of the big moment where everything changed, which it absolutely fucking wasn't. Like 23 years later, we would not have like J.K. Rowling being awful. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot of it is sort of like the evidence is there to say that no, it did not have this profound societal impact.
No.
Though also I can't prove a negative either, and I can't say that like things would be worse or better. I don't know, but
Well, everything's incremental, right? Like it
I
might not
guess
have even if this movie didn't directly influence something, hopefully maybe someone reading Logan's blog or someone, if
yeah.
there's any number of things that like analysis or people having seen and experienced and like trying to process this movie and led to something. And I don't know if it's actually accurate or not, but I feel like anytime you can sort of start a conversation, even if it's not starting a good conversation, like it's probably helping eventually somewhere. So Again, not good, but maybe not 100% bad. But maybe that's trying to be too optimistic about a thing that like is not good.
So no time for optimism, Joey.
I guess not. I'm trying, man.
Logan, do you have anything good to say about this movie? Is there any like what's the best possible thing that emerged from this movie's existence?
Oh, I'm okay. The girl who plays Lisa Lambert, I think, is actually really good, and I wish that they had done more with her character besides just like being somewhere for Brandon to be at the end of the film.
Wait, is that
because
Alison Folland? Is that who that is?
No.
Alicia.
Oh yeah,
Goranson?
okay. Yeah.
I butchered that last name, but I don't know why they changed her character name. Her name was Candace in real life, and she was the other one of the three people who were murdered that night, including her he was either currently her boyfriend or her ex-boyfriend, Philip DeLevine, who was also killed that night. And like from what I've been able to read, like she had like a really good relationship with Brandon. Like she loved him. Like found out about his identity and was still like, oh, who gives a shit? Like I still love this guy. And like that, I'm like, there's like, I know that it makes the big love story between him and Lana less special, but like, why not show that he has like all these people behind him? And so like, I really like her performance, and I wish that she had had more to do and that they hadn't like twisted her character in the way they had to like make her the one who like pushes the dominoes down, in a matter of speaking.
Fair enough. All right, we got a few minutes left, so let's get back into the fun stuff. We always
Is it time for my questions?
It is time for Joey's questions. We always end the podcast with 2 questions. Logan, you are again, your life is post 1999, so I don't know how strong your feelings are to the first question. But Joey, take it away.
Do you have a favorite movie from the year 1999?
Oh, I know I must. Let me look
He's
at
like,
what movies
I've
came
only
out
seen
in
Boys Don't Cry, so I
1999.
guess by default, it's Boys
You're
Don't
gonna do
Cry.
the thing now where you're gonna look at the list and then you're gonna be like, "Oh, I see why you're doing a podcast about this year." This happens every once in a while.
Literally right now I'm looking at 3 really good ones. Oh god. Okay. Talented Mr. Ripley, I fucking love.
Nice.
Ravenous.
Oh,
Ravenous, good. I'm probably gonna have to go. I fucking love that movie. Have you guys seen Ravenous?
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Yes. I had no idea what it was before I went into it. I was just looking for more Western horror films, and literally everything about it is like, it's like, it feels like if Sam Raimi made like a Western horror film. Like it's just so batshit and fun and like this weird homoeroticism.
Yeah.
And like it's everything you want in like a cannibal horror film like set in this time period.
That's great. I'm glad. That's a really good answer. I'm glad you, because in our first episode when we talked to Brian Raftery, one of the movies that he mentions is like, look out for this one, because this is one of those ones that keeps coming up in like a lot of people's weird favorites of that year. It's Ravenous. And I was like, okay, cool. You're the first person to actually specifically call it out by name, but
Yes.
This is our second to last episode of the first round. So I'm glad we closed that loop. Talented Mr. Ripley, also, again, that's been mentioned before. I am a huge fan of that movie, and can't wait till we get to that episode as well.
Logan, have you read the book, The Secret History?
I have not yet. I know it's like I have like a reading list. It's like 1,000 books long. I have many things I need to read.
It's aesthetically kind of similar-ish in ways to Talented Mr. Ripley. Like when I was reading that book, my friend was like, "You should watch Mr. Ripley because it's like there's not an adaptation. Like it probably should be adapted, but it's sort of like if you love that movie the way that you do, like you might find stuff in The Secret History that you might like because Don Hart's a great writer, and that's a good book. So.
Yes, I will check that out.
Poking around. It's also 600 pages. So like, if you're like, I don't have time for that, it's like, I get it.
I'll cut my way through it.
And then question number 2, do you have a favorite movie of all time, and is it Sleepaway Camp?
Oh, God. If I had to pick, the answer is yes, but it's like a spot shared by like 5 different movies depending on my mood. It's one of those things.
What's the 5?
Okay, Evil Dead 2 is just like a fucking classic.
Whoa! Not Evil Dead 1, Evil Dead 2.
No, I think most people like Evil Dead 2 more than Evil Dead 1.
Evil Dead 1 is definitely good.
Okay, I
It's
guess I
definitely
should
good.
not be talking because I say Empire Strikes Back and not Star Wars, but like, it's weird to me when people pick a sequel as and not like, you know, because like there would be no Evil
Paddington
Dead
2
2
is the
without
best
Evil
movie
Dead.
that's ever been made, so that's, you know.
Okay, fine, Evil Dead 2, keep going.
I feel like Evil Dead 2 is the movie that he wanted to make if he had the budget for the first movie, right?
Yes.
Like
I
that's the
haven't
movie
seen
that.
Evil Dead 2 yet.
Get back to me when you
have.
do. Holy shit! It's
No,
Yeah,
I've
man.
seen it. I'm quoting high
Okay,
fidelity.
okay.
It's
Yes,
fine.
fuck.
I've definitely seen Evil Dead.
I'm like, oh no.
I'm now in John Cusack mode.
I quoted Hot Fuzz to our friend Desiree because she's like, I haven't seen Bad Boys 2. I'm like, you ain't seen Bad Boys 2? Not necessarily on par with Evil Dead 2, but you know, it's weird that there's all these movies referring to indignation about not seeing sequels.
Yeah, but am I gonna see Evil Dead 2? Well, yeah, okay. All right, Evil Dead 2. What else? What else do you like?
Oh, Ginger Snaps. That is one movie
Oh,
that it formed the
answer.
shit out of me as a 19-year-old. I can't imagine the damage that would have done to my brain as like a child. Little Shop of Horrors. That I have seen that movie probably like 15 times. It never gets old.
I saw that for the first time last year. Do you like the theatrical ending or the director's cut ending?
I like
The upper or the downer?
I like the upper. I can't do downer endings in a movie that just like happy.
Sure, I get it.
Yeah. I saw it on Broadway, and I'd forgotten that the Broadway ending is the downer ending, and I was like, "Oh right, everybody dies!" Like, that's
Yay.
awesome! Hooray! Those are your three: Evil Dead 2, Ginger Snaps, Little Shop of Horrors.
He said 5. There might be more.
You said
I'm
5. You
curious.
can do 2 more if you want to.
Because I also like that you said, you know, in different moods, but I feel like they're all similar-ish moods. Like they're not like wildly different movies.
They're all
They're
like,
different.
they're all
There's
weird
a
horror
theme emerging
comedies.
here for sure.
They're all movies where I have or plan to write about how they're actually about trans people.
Nice.
Oh, Little Women is a movie that I turn on when I want to fucking cry.
The Winona one or the new one?
The Greta Gerwig one.
Hell yeah, the good one.
I haven't seen the Winona one yet.
I am quitting the podcast.
You're telling me that I could watch a movie with Florence Pugh or a movie without Florence Pugh, and I'm supposed to choose the one without Florence Pugh in it?
The original has literally everyone I've ever been in love with who is my wife. Like it is.
Yeah, and the new one is that for me too. So it's
Claire
fine.
Danes, fucking Samantha Mathis. Like Jesus fucking Christ! It is Christian Bale's in that movie. Eric Stoltz is in that movie. Gabriel Byrne's in that movie. Like fucking hell, that movie is incredible.
We got Hermione. We got Timothy Chalamet. We got Bob Odenkirk. We got Florence Pugh.
I admire the new one. The 1994 version is the best. Logan, go watch it right now.
I will.
But
look. We got Meryl.
I love
Saoirse.
We named my twin daughters after Little Women, so I appreciate. So my twins are Josephine and Louisa.
That's so cute.
So yeah, so I appreciate the answer. Any Little Women is good Little Women, and you know, whatever. But like 94, cannot touch it. Sorry, Joey. Sorry, young people. I know you're like your
cool
new millennial. I know you're like your cool millennial Little Women, but can't fucking touch that Thomas Newman score, baby. That's where the gold's at. Anyways, wow, what a strange path.
Wait, do you have one more? Logan, is there one more?
The Muppet movie from 1979.
Fuck yeah, there you go. Okay. All right.
I have to have one like movie that doesn't like put me in a stone cold bummer by the end of it.
For someone who's been alive for 22 years, Logan, good. You were brought up right. Okay, we're going to wrap this up. But Logan, thank you so much for joining us and for having this conversation with us. And before we go, would you like to tell people out in the world where to find you on the internet if you so desire?
Of course, and fucking thank you guys so much for having me on. This was like an incredible opportunity to be mad about a movie in a really fun way.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at transhorrors, and in my bio I have a link to basically all my writings. If you don't want to go to my Twitter, I'm on Medium at, I think it's /a translog. That's where most of my writing is, and it's where most of my trans horror writing is as well.
Joey, thanks. Logan, thanks. Don't go watch Boys Don't Cry if you haven't already.
Go watch Sleepaway Camp.
Go watch Sleepaway Camp. Both Little Women and